Kanaka? We're picking a fight with our most reliable and pleasant friend, the labradoodle of allies?
This conversation started with an apology. It was sent to me over email from a friend and former office mate named Alan Calhoun. Alan's apology concerned certain tensions existing between the United States and Canada that many of us are feeling right now. And while part of my reply to Alan's apology email was that he is not the one that needs to be saying sorry, there was something about the motivations behind this heartfelt gesture that prompted me to ask the following question. What if this email signaled an opportunity for us to get our other two former office mates together to hit record and talk about these geopolitical tensions out in the open, just as we used to when we were back in Aberdeen, Scotland, working on our doctoral projects and taking periodic breaks to have the kinds of discussions you're about to be thrown into? As you'll discover, this conversation features the perspectives of two Christians living in America, one Christian living in Canada, and one Christian living in Ireland. The one from Ireland, Kevin Hargaden, takes on the role of host and mediator for the Americans and the Canadian, and in doing so, we create a little bit of time and space for all of us to live out in real time a truly personalist conversation. A dialogue that seeks to find our common personhood in a moment when the personhood of the other is being denied more and more and with devastating results. As per usual with Personalist Manifesto's conversations, I can't promise that what you're about to hear will be easy to listen to, but I can urge you to go on this dialogue journey with us as we arrive at some final words from Kevin that hit the proverbial nail on the head. If we're looking for a way out of these predicaments we find ourselves in, it all comes down to faithfulness in a moment of flux. And so, with that, here's my conversation with Alan, Kevin, and David about having no new words, only old words, to share about what it means to be faithful, truly faithful, in fearful moments of flux. Welcome to a Personalist Manifesto's first, where we have multiple guests, and I want to start by talking about the origin story of this multiple guest conversation. For those who aren't in the know, things have got a little bit complicated these days geopolitically, and there's been some tension, as it were, between the United States of America and Canada. And I was at work the other day, and I got a nice email from Alan Calhoun, who is in this conversation. And he wrote me this really nice email and said, Michael, I just like to check in on my friends, and I felt the need to check in on you. And I wanted to say, I'm sorry. From someone in the States to someone in Canada, I'm sorry. So I reply to Alan's email. I say, Alan, you absolute gem. You don't need to apologize. This is not on you. The very fact that you are sending me this email shows me that you don't need to be the one saying sorry. But thanks anyways. And hey, what if we carried on this conversation, but we invited two people to join it? Two people by the name of David Lilley and Kevin Hargaden, who comprised a group of people who shared an office in Aberdeen when we were all working on our PhDs. And so I just thought, what if we did that? And Alan's like, yeah, we should do that. So we put the email call out to Kevin and David, and they said, yeah, we are up for this. We are going to have a conversation about this tricky geopolitical situation. We're going to have one Canadian theologian, two American theologians, and one Irish theologian try to sort this stuff out. So here we are. Before we get into that conversation that hopefully sorts some things out, I think we do need some introductions just to know where everybody's coming from. So Dave, do you want to start? And then, Kevin and Alan, you can sort of share who you are, and then we'll work through some questions and talk through some things.
Sure. Yeah, my name's Dave Lilley. I am in the area of Nashville, Tennessee. right now, where I teach a bit at Belmont University in the School of Theology and Christian Ministry, and I pastor full-time a United Methodist Church in this area.
Awesome. Thanks for joining us. Kevin, you're
Uh,
next.
yeah, I am a social theologian, which sadly doesn't mean that I have like an expense account to take people out for drinks. It's an idiosyncratic Jesuit term that
And you're also very
describes.
introverted too, so you're not very
Yeah,
social.
yeah, yeah. I mean, I'm warm and hospitable, but please don't talk to me for more than 45 minutes. So yeah, I work for the Jesuits here in Ireland. They sometimes mistake me for a Jesuit, and so around the internet you'll see Kevin Hargaden, comma SJ. I'm not a Jesuit. I'm married and have kids, so that is a set of obstacles to becoming a Jesuit. I'm also an elder in the Presbyterian Church, and that appears to be an obstacle to me becoming a Jesuit as well, sadly. So my work is at the intersection between Christian ethics, moral theology, and Irish public policy. So I'm both in the classroom in three of the theology faculties in Dublin, and I'm engaging with civil servants and elected representatives here in Ireland on the topics that the Jesuits are particularly concerned with, which are criminal justice, housing and homelessness, environmental care, and economic equality.
Thank you. Which is exactly why you are going to be host after introductions.
Yeah,
Because you're going to play the role of mediator, conflict mediator, as it were. And in doing so, you can impart some wisdom and ask the tough questions for the other
Jesuits are
people in the
all
room.
about reconciliation, Michael. I'm
Yeah.
I'm, I'm ready to pretend to be a Jesuit.
Okay, good. Alan, last but not least, who
Well,
are you? Where do you hail from?
I'm
Tell
in
us your tale.
Virginia, Virginia, USA.
Hmm.
Not necessarily proud of the USA part at the moment, but anyway, I am I call myself a recovering lawyer. I am an attorney by background and trade, tax lawyer, in fact, to make it even worse than just regular lawyer. And I have worked since beginning my PhD at Aberdeen and sharing an office with these wonderful minds, these wonderful gentlemen. I have worked at the intersection of tax law and theology, which I think falls within the parameters of political theology. So maybe I can call myself a political theologian of sorts. I still work in the tax law area, but on the side, I do have a variety of political theology projects percolating, and they're very interesting. And it's a great privilege to be here with these fine people again.
Likewise. Yeah. Well, thanks for joining. So, Kevin, this is where I officially pass the host mic to you. Take it away. Ask the tough questions. We're
Thanks,
here. We'll
Michael.
give you our perspective as best as we can.
Well, I'm glad that I have this role because I am uh, an acknowledged expert on these topics. I have spent as many as 11 days in Canada
Hmm.
and maybe twice as many days in the United States of America. So I'm glad that I have the kind of in-depth knowledge of both of your cultures to be able to share this conversation. Granting that I am basically an ignoramus, can you tell me what does America, the United States of America, and Canada have in common aside from a landmass? And how are they different?
Well, that, I mean, I feel like Michael's gonna have to carry a lot of weight in talking about this as
Hmm.
the one Canadian in the room here. Um,
But wait a second, Dave, you're from northern New York.
Yeah, you
well,
were almost on the border there.
well,
Yeah,
that
Yeah.
I was on the board. That's what I was gonna say. You got a landmass, but we got, I grew up around a thing called the Peace Bridge, which growing up in Buffalo, New York, from which there are three different bridges that go directly into Canada. Um, when I was a child, I routinely went out for breakfast in Canada with my grandparents on a Saturday morning. That was our most frequent outing that I had with my grandparents growing up. Like Canada was the town next door. Um, and so, similarities and differences largely was like, oh, one's on one side of the river and one's on the other side. Uh, the driver was semi-required to show their driver's license when you went across the border. Nobody else in the car needed ID, whether an adult or a kid. Um, we learned in school it was the longest unguarded border in the world. That was a source of pride that we grew up with, just having it right across there. We had, if there was a couple local Christian private schools that had Canadian students who would just drive across Monday through Friday every morning to go to school, stop at the mall on their way back and go back home. Like this was the similarities was very much what I grew up with and still
Yeah.
is my internal memory and knowledge of it. And it's very bizarre to have, because I haven't lived in Western New York for most of my adulthood. It's been about 20 years. So it's a very strange thing right now to have the news be so reflective of this difference and distance when my internal experience and love, that deep-seated love is of similarity. And so yeah, I feel very like it's hard to put a finger on those differences exactly, um, in this present context because it's so different than the direct experience.
Now, Alan, you grew up almost in the south.
Yes.
Yeah. So was Canada like a remote and exotic place of poutine and ice hockey and other things that you can't possibly grasp and comprehend?
Well,
People who speak French voluntarily.
places where I grew up tended to think that the snow never melted in the summer in Canada, but then they think that about part of the US too. I mean, these are big countries. These are huge countries, and there's a lot of misinformation, misunderstanding, and a sense of distance, even from one part of the US to the other. And I expect the same is true in Canada. In fact, I'm sure it is, maybe even more so. Um, so yeah, but but I always had the sense that it was the closest possible relationship that two countries could possibly have without being one country. And that's kind of the irony of this current predicament in the US administration's push to attempt to unite the two countries. They've actually driven apart two countries that were in many ways functioning almost as one in some respects, because I'm certainly old enough to remember when all you needed was a driver's license, and that was just sort of a perfunctory wave when you crossed the border. I guess passports came in after 9/11. You had to show a passport, but that wasn't anybody's fault in North America, presumably.
Hmm.
So yeah, it's strange. It's just a weird feeling. It's a weird feeling to have the relationship between the two countries torn apart.
Yeah,
Now, Michael, you're actually a Canadian
it's true.
who's born and raised there.
Yeah.
Uh, I grew up in the smaller body with the United Kingdom within touching distance, literally. Some people's houses are, the living rooms are in the Republic of Ireland and their kitchens are in the United Kingdom because of the border with Northern Ireland. So we had a much keener appreciation of the differences between the nation states on what is it? The Irish government doesn't call it the British Isles. We call it the islands of the North Atlantic. So do Canadians have a much keener appreciation of the differences with the chip on the shoulder of being the slightly smaller entity?
I think one of the things that I acknowledge that like internationally we are viewed as kind of the smaller, maybe more friendly, maybe, more boring version. And in some respects, like fair enough. We don't always do much to contradict that view. I would say if we're getting like to practical differences, I mean, we're still part of the Commonwealth, right? So
It's a big difference.
it is a sort of most Canadians maybe wouldn't point to that, but I think that's an important starting point is to say we're still attached to the United Kingdom. And so we didn't have our nation didn't start when we were, rebelling against sort of the imperial rule of the UK, right? So I think those are very different starting points. So that is one difference. But I think in terms of like where I live is in Vancouver, which is about 2, 3 hours away from Seattle. So you get like those are very similar cities. And it doesn't snow often here. It rains because we're on the Pacific Ocean. So I'm not cold all the time. I'm usually just damp and grouchy because it's dark and rainy in the winter, right? But then, of course, as you get more into the middle of Canada, then you're getting what most people think, which is like sub-zero temperatures. And oh, and we're in Celsius, by the way, not Fahrenheit, which is why it's sub-zero. Um, so yeah, the more middle Canada, the more you get what people think is like lots of snow and, people saying a lot and that sort of stuff. And then you get into Ontario, and that's like where the real good maple syrup is and such. Um, but I think number one, we're part of the Commonwealth still. So how that plays out is, I actually think, and I really pondered this a lot living overseas in Scotland for 4 years. Like, what does it actually mean to be Canadian? And I think the ways that Canadians often articulate who they are is to say what they are not. So for Canadians, like, well, we're not really able to articulate who we are, but we're definitely not like that. So often the States plays a sort of counterpoint, right? And then when things get really sort of heated, in mainstream discourse, media, all these ideologies sort of are spinning around out there, we often like to say, well, we may have some problems internally, but they're not as bad as over there, right? And so I actually opened up a chapter that I did recently in a book saying Canadians are in this position of being able to sort of lay claim to the best of what the United States and Britain have and do, and performatively deny the worst of what they have and do.
Mm.
So we are very good at whenever something bad happens in one of these nations, we can be like, not like us. We're really, really good, virtue signaling. But then when something good happens, they're like, oh yeah, like, we're just like them. So I I I realized in saying all of this that I am not representing like a typical Canadian's view, but I think it's my responsibility as a Christian who happens to live in Canada to be very honest about the good and the bad here, because it is easy for me to be uh, playing this sort of we're better card, but I don't think that that's the right way to do it. But I think these are some of the differences is like we do have commonalities with the States and the UK, but there are also pieces that I think are distinct to us that go beyond just falling in those two different camps. So we're similar basically, but there are some differences and maybe we can get into those for sure.
But if we go back to Dave's experience growing up in Buffalo, the
Mhm.
kids who came across the border to go to school, they actually did have concrete realities that weren't available to you, Dave, right? Am I right, Michael, in saying that those kids would have had some form of universal health care?
Yep. Yep. That's
They
a
would have
that's a
had
difference.
Yeah.
a mu much better developed social security net.
Hmm. Yeah.
These are like probably social housing would have been not that the kids who were going to a private fee-paying Christian school ever ever would have necessarily needed social housing, but there would have been provision in a much more social democratic fashion. Gun crime would have been
Yes,
much
that is oh
lower.
yeah.
Uh,
So that yeah, so that's a really good concrete example, right? Is that yes, we probably are more leaning towards those types of like political expressions and social approaches and infrastructure, right? Like universal health care, certain welfare things that you might be getting access to in Canada that you might not get in the States. However, what a Canadian can do is be like, well, look at us. We're so good
the
in
best of all
comparison
worlds.
to, right?
Yeah.
But then it's like, yeah, but let's also compare maybe on the world stage. And then it also depends on like what era we're talking about in Canada. And it also depends on like we're approaching a federal election and there are people who are wanting to actually defund and hack and slash and take away some of these things that maybe some of us might say are just like this is just how it is in Canada. So um yes, there are certain things historically and presently that you would have in Canada that you wouldn't see in the States, healthcare and so on. And yet we are always at threat of having those things dismantled in part or maybe even in whole. It just depends on who's in power and what sort of ideology playbook they want to reference and so on.
Yeah, now, Alan talked about Canada and the USA, in the past being the closest that countries could possibly be together. So what has gone wrong?
Well, I'll jump in and I'll just say one of our strategies as Canadians has been to look around on the schoolyard and be like, who's the biggest bully? I'm going to make friends with them so nobody can bully me. Maybe that works for a while, but then like, you know, what happens if the bully turns on you? I don't know if that sounds too mean, Dave and Ellen, but I feel like that's been a little bit of our strategy and maybe that's worked for a while, but apparently it's not now. So
Well, and
So
we
you feel like that there's been a strategic cozying up to the United States of America
oh
that
yeah,
worked as long as the USA was playing by the rule book, and now
yeah, yeah. Well, there was I think, I mean, John Stewart um, had when this initial bullying was happening, he did a bit that just nailed it. He's like, you know, beating up on Canada is like beating up on your Labradoodle. Like your Labradoodle has been loyal to you forever. It's followed you everywhere and done everything you've told it to do. Like
was Canada part of the coalition of the willing?
just like so basically it's like, they followed you into like pretty much every war that you've declared,
Oh God,
and all
yeah.
these sorts of things, and now you're turning around and beating up on them. Like, come on, like pick somebody that has at least wronged you. I don't
Okay,
know why I'm laughing, but it's just like he's
it's
right.
yeah.
It's
this is
totally
the
true.
narrative. This is the
Right?
narrative we're getting in the rest of the world that
Yeah.
America is bullying Canada. But I mean, look, I'm not trying to defend the bully, but I do want to give Alan and Dave an opportunity to say, wait a second, Canada has been taking the proverbial in this way or that way. Is there any reasonable justification that Alan and Dave can see for why America has decided to uh
Well, there's a justification. I don't think it's reasonable, but there is a justification. I mean, this whole so-called reciprocal tariffs thing, which is not reciprocal at all, is not based on responding to tariffs in kind. It's based on responding to a trade deficit. And there has been tension between the US and Canada for decades regarding lumber, steel and aluminum, and automobiles and auto parts. And the U.S. is in a trade deficit situation with regard to some aspects of those goods, but it's kind of like saying that I'm in a trade deficit situation with my coffee shop because I spent $3, $4 for coffee, and they have my money, and all I have is the coffee. And how is that fair? So I'm going to impose a tariff on the coffee shop, and now I have to pay $8 for the coffee. I mean, it just doesn't make any sense because the tariffs are not responding to tariffs, they're responding to a trade deficit. But the trade deficit that the US keeps finding itself in with other countries is probably just the result of the fact that the other countries provide better goods, better natural resources. And also because the US is not a manufacturing country, it hasn't been for a long time. It's a service industry country, and it has the luxury of doing things that it wants to do, doing jobs that it wants to do, and buying goods from other countries that may or may not have that luxury. Although this argument probably works better with the U.S.'s relationship with poorer countries. Canada, if anything, is by some measures even wealthier than the U.S. So I don't know if it really works, but um, I, I think that the justification is trade deficit. I think that justification is unreasonable because a trade deficit is not necessarily a sign that something has gone wrong
Mm.
with the US or with the US and Canada and their relationship.
I
And
mean, Vermont
go ahead, Dave.
might like to be the primary supplier of maple syrup for the entire United States, but it's just not nearly as big as Canada. So,
Right,
we
right.
need.
I mean,
Well,
you can say that the trade balance is unfair, but the question is not whether it's fair. The question is whether it's mutually beneficial, and it has been, and it was, and it. I think since it's my understanding that basically since 1854, the two countries until 2018, the two countries worked hard to move toward free trade, except for a period of protectionism around the time of the Great Depression. But that was universal. The U.S. went into protectionist mode in the most robust way during that time toward everybody, maybe like it's doing now. Uh, yeah, I mean, it's hard for me to see what the problem is.
well, I would just add too, like one of the things that I find concerning is how like the reaction that you get from Canada, right? So it like we're dragged into a situation where it's like, okay, well, this unreasonable move has been made, so we're going to respond to something unreasonable with equal unreason. And so like the tariffs breed counter tariffs, and then the protectionism breeds protectionism, and then nationalism breeds nationalism. And this, as a Canadian, I am concerned about what's happening over the border in the States, but I'm concerned about what's happening here, like just how this has inflamed a type of protectionism and and nationalism that like I have never seen. And so now when I go to the grocery store, products are being labeled like this is Canadian, this isn't. As I'm hearing on the radio now, everybody's talking about how they're a proudly Canadian company, or this is bottled in Canada. And that is a reaction to this. And so don't get me wrong when I say that like, oh, we're just being beat up on and we're doing nothing. I'm actually concerned about the way that we're responding, because I think this type of protectionism and nationalism in general is bad, full stop, whether it's American, Canadian, or any nation. Like it's scary when any of this stuff happens. Personally, I don't know if y'all are scared by it, but it concerns me.
Well,
I, I,
just the other day, just to not rabbit trail in it, but I bought at the store a box of Quaker oats, which is a staple in our house. I don't know that Quaker is a company in Ireland, Kevin, but it's they're quick.
I think it's globally familiar.
Okay,
Yeah.
I thought so.
It's a
You got the
globally
picture,
recognized brand.
and it's a group among other pacifist groups that have this long history of migration back and forth across the U.S.-Canada border, depending on which side of that border was in a stronger persecution mode against pacifists and against resistant groups in that moment. And I noticed that when I got this box, it had a big red stamp on the top that I had not ever seen before. It said "Made in Canada." Like, whoa, it
Hmm.
was surprising that was on this side of the border in buying it with that kind of proud logo on, but I had never noticed that, yeah, before. And it was like, whoa, there's a shift happening here. That would have normally just been small print on the bottom, and now it was like a stamp, and it was very, very noticeable. And
And Dave, do you think that the overtures towards Canada that have been made by the current American administration, are they fueled in any way by American nationalism?
um, in that, so I would, so I'm glad you brought a good group together here, because Alan's telling the story of history. He's naming dates. He's naming, putting it in these like legal term where when I, see these things playing out, I see like the same thing we see with the Doge thing of like the memification of government. So growing up out at the border as I did, it was just a regular joke, like, oh, the 51st state. Like that was just, like every Springfield and whatever the town next door is in Simpsons, whatever, there's always the neighbor is the one you're making fun of, whatever it is. In DC, everybody made fun of Maryland. Buffalo, everyone makes fun of Canada. It's you make fun of who your neighbor is. That's who your jokes are about. And so 51st state was always like just the standard joke. I haven't heard Greenland called the 51st state in the conversations about Greenland. It's like, oh, we're allowing this just like the jokes you make. And by the time I was like 13, I was like, yeah, I'm making these jokes still because, you have Canadian friends, you got to make fun of them, just like they're, vice versa. Um, but like, I also kind of am jealous of some of these healthcare things that Canada has, and I see some good things on that side. But it's like, that's the story of it that I see is just this growth of, oh, this is the insult we have, and so we're just going to play it out at this like government level of this. It feels like it's the irrelevance of Canada, which is not irrelevant, but it's like the same way that individual U.S. citizens being mistreated are being treated as like irrelevant, just to make a point in public. That it's like, oh, you are handy as the one on whom I can play a joke to make a point totally unrelated to you. And then obviously there's this army of lawyers working out the numbers and or one guy with a calculator working out the math on how they frame the tariffs, whatever.
Dave, I love that you think it's a guy with a calculator, but in fact they've admitted it's a guy with a stupid large language model.
Yeah.
Well, this
Yeah.
is I call
If
those
only it was a calculator. Yeah.
Yeah.
I don't know technology well. It's all just if it has buttons, it's a calculator.
Michael, when Dave describes the memification of the American government, surely the Canadian response is rational and reasonable and should be welcomed. Why are you so concerned about nationalism?
Why?
Yeah,
Well, I do think that the memification and the nationalism go together. Um, like that they're one is a sort of instantiation of the other, which is a much larger phenomenon. But I think what's concerning is anytime nations start identifying with a very sort of capital U us and a very capital T them, and a level of pride and sort of national identification, it breeds suspicion and hostility towards those who are outside of it. And I mean, if we want to talk history, just look at history and how that tends to go. It doesn't end well, right? When these sorts of things happen. And I think, I speak from a Christian perspective where if you happen to be a Christian, um, that identity and that citizenship um, is foregrounded, and any other citizenship plays a very, very distant second. So, yes, I was born and raised in Canada. I have a Canadian passport. That means I'm Canadian. But as a Christian, um, I would say that anytime a nation or institution or person tries to get in between fidelity to neighbor, whoever they happen to be, um, that call, because of identification with, the nation that's attached to my passport, that's when I start to get worried.
yeah.
Right? Because I'm called to love my neighbor, and I am grafted into a people who were sojourners. And yeah, that people is settled down, and I've settled down, but to be a Christian is to be a pilgrim, a sojourner on earth, and to welcome in the sojourner. And so when you're hardening borders and nationalizing trade and protect, it's like it's really hard to be faithful to that call when you're doing that stuff. And all the risks that come with what happens when we ignore the call to love our neighbor, even the other, all the very real risks that happen when we're not faithful to that call.
And what are those risks? Like, what do you have in mind?
Uh, really, if we're just going to boil it down to the basics, poor people, people who are vulnerable, people are being persecuted, right? People who,
Disappeared.
yeah, disappeared or, um, you know, just treated as enemies and threats when I think Jesus is pretty clear that, oh, that I am them.
Yeah.
Are you going to care for them? So, yeah, I just and I think it's like quite practically speaking, the kinds of rhetoric that we hear, a lot of this rhetoric very practically tends to privilege those who are already in power and have wealth and just accumulates more for them and leaves those who didn't have much to begin with even less.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting when you phrase it that way, that those who are already in power, those who already have privilege, kind of gain a momentum in the accumulation of their capacities. Alan, would it be fair to say that whatever about the turn to Canadian nationalism in the last couple of months, American nationalism is not a new thing? And there might be a narrative that's suggesting that, the second Trump administration is has kind of popped into existence as this dreadful beast of nationalist fervor, the memification, to use Dave's great term.
Yeah,
But there's continuity, isn't there? Like,
well, definitely. Yeah, there's definitely continuity. The problem I see with American nationalism is that it's so it's so profoundly hypocritical because it always presents itself as based on an ideal rather than some sort of racial or ethnic or even, in a sense, geographical identity. And yet that's exactly what it is. It is a sense of racial superiority that's rearing its ugly head right now. I mean, it clearly is. I don't see how anybody could deny that a lot of what's driving the policies that we're seeing unfolding before us in the United States and from the United States toward other countries is motivated by some sort of sense of racial superiority. And yet, because of the history of the United States, uh, it's able to present, the country is able to present itself more as an idea than a place. It's able to present itself as um, a constellation of values. I mean, I know other countries try that too. I know that the UK is always talking about British values. I've never actually been able to ascertain what those values might be, but it's a term that they throw out a lot. The US actually has documents that can sort of express these values. And that tends to cover over a multitude of sins, but the problem is that the sins are very much still there. And I guess in a way, part of me, a small part of me, appreciates what has happened in 2016 and again in 2024 because it's pulled the cover off. I mean, it's revealed American nationalism for what it really is. And it's not just a proud um, expression, articulation of the sort of democracy, the sort of republicanism, small r republicanism that is outlined in the founding documents, in the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution. It's something much more insidious, and it's kind of hard to deny that now. It may have been in the past, although there have been times in the past when the cover was pulled off too, clearly. The
yeah,
Native
yeah.
movement, the McCarthy era in the 50s, um, certainly Jim Crow, of course, slavery that's a whole different can of worms. I don't even want to go there, but um, yeah, part of me appreciates the fact that we're calling a spade now.
Mm.
And that spade is definitely rhetorical cover for kind of global military superiority. It's rhetorical cover for a certain kind of self-serving capitalism.
Definitely.
But Dave, this American nationalism, it's also fundamentally religious in nature, isn't it? So how should Christians understand these competing nationalisms and how they're like uh, exerting a force on the world?
It is a rapidly shifting relation between of the religious and the nationalist part of that. You hear the phrase Christian nationalist, use that here. Um, and it's rapidly shifting in terms of the practical demographics of what that actually looks like. The last several years have seen the most rapid exodus of those most fervently kind of nationalist in their politics, in terms of the group that would be called like evangelicals in particular, of actual church attendance. That group has been, from my pastoral side, not just my direct experience, but reading the numbers on that, like that group is largely disappearing from pews all over the place, much more rapidly than any other. So, at this point, it looked like for a period there, all the what we call the mainline churches were, the less evangelical can be just as nationalistic, but they looked like the ones where there was an exodus happening, and then suddenly that was turned on its head, and so there's still this. I'm struggling to put my finger on the precise relation at this point. I'm really relying on others to do that work and to put, because it's changed so swiftly. Um, and
I
it's
mean,
still religious
just
at
to
its heart,
remind
but like
people,
not. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
you're actually pastoring in the Bible Belt, so to speak.
Yeah, yeah.
And you're saying things are in flux so dramatically that you can't make head nor tails of it.
I drive every day. We in the town where we live near the mega church in town, which routinely hosts a former, excuse me, presidential candidate who now is a talking head on Fox News, is like preaches from this pulpit nearby. At present, uh, the first time that I entered this building, there was a conference that was hosted there I went to, and on my way in from the parking lot inside, I passed a mural which featured a number of things, including a very large, like, U.S. soldier, but not a cross anywhere in sight on this mural. At
So,
present, there is a giant flag of Israel flying behind this church, and they have bumper stickers all over town that preceded the current crisis that say on them, "Support Israel," is the phrase. Um, Support being like such a strong and odd choice of phrase there, and that I don't know the origin of these. They've been there for years. They were there before we moved here, um, and so this is there is still like this essential connection practically to these like sources of political power of these large evangelical institutions, um, that are very intentionally politically directed and connected. Um, but then in the smaller settings, in the actual just week to week presence of people who might show up at a rally in a service of worship, it's that relation is changing very, very, very quickly. And so, yeah, it's at the moment, there's still the religious part to it, the religious self-understanding, but actual practice of religion. And so what I would say, oh, Christian life is disappearing. Um, and so it's, yeah, that's as far as I can see. I have literally no foresight into where we're heading of the relationship between the Christian part of this, at least in name, and the rest of it. Yeah.
Now, you guys know me, you know that I'm prone sometimes to swearing, but I very rarely use the F word. I think the F word needs to be constrained and deployed only in the most technically correct senses. But Michael, is it time for us to admit that your neighbor is becoming a fascist state?
I would. Here's the thing. Uh, I want to say I want to respond to that in two ways. There's a book actually on my floor, but my bookshelf is in shambles, so I won't pull it out. But it's a really large book. It was called The Authoritarian Personality, And it was a study done by the Frankfurt School, Adorno, Horkheimer,
Yeah.
and all those people, uh, like
People who
around,
fled fascism.
yeah, and mostly Jews who fled
Yeah.
fascism. But they conducted a study to say, to find out, like, are there certain attributes within the modern individual, and of course this was in Germany, but they also conducted studies in the States on this, like, that show a predisposition to authoritarianism, fascism, and so on. And they did a study, and they're like, yeah, there are. And the forward to that book is really helpful because the uh, person who sort of oversaw the release of the volume just says, using the word authoritarianism or fascism can can make us, uh, sort of, it can be a mobilizing cry of alarm, right, to get us to pay attention, but also it can have a sort of, it can work like a sedative too, where it calms you down, like, oh, that's an aberration, right?
Hmm.
So they're sort of like the, on the fringes, right? We hear this a lot, actually, right? They're a fringe figure, but then you start to actually talk about these things, you're like, well, maybe they're speaking from the fringes, but like there's inroads into very, sort of influential, like, perspectives, practices or whatever. So I'm very careful when to use it and when not to use it. And this is the second part of my response is, until we are all willing to acknowledge that authoritarian impulse in ourselves, uh, we should be careful about putting it out there. So, like, Alan and David have both been very forthcoming about the flaws of their nation, right? And this is typically where Canadians just are quiet and say, and just let him be like, see, not as bad as them, never
Mm.
us. But I'm like, okay, sure. Alan referenced slavery, right? Like, that's a whole can of worms. And Canadians can say our record's better on that. Okay. But what about our history of colonization of indigenous people? Our last residential school closed in the 90s, and we're still discovering unmarked graves. And so, as a Canadian, I can always look over the border and be like, well, not as bad as that, or, not as, colonial or imperial, or as, proto-authoritarian or proto-fascist, or just full blown either as them. But I'm like, how do I understand the land that I have been raised on and see the history and the present of colonization on my land? And how do I see the impulses in me that wants to say, I want power, I want wealth, and I don't want anybody else to have it? And so this is like my very long-winded response is to say, maybe we're at the point where we should use it, but if we use it, we should also be willing to do a little bit of self-investigation and critique and be like, maybe it's a little bit closer to home too, and we need to be careful. And maybe we're all closer to this move than we would like to think. And until we do that, we have, less of the resources we need to spot it and resist it. So maybe, but only if we're willing to just see how we actually have the potential inherent in ourselves to be exactly the same thing. The minute we don't, we're in trouble.
I mean, I hear what you're saying, but as a citizen of the Republic of Ireland, we have our own problems, and our last mother and baby home closed in 1996, 1997. So, we have a history of institutionalization of people who don't fit whatever societal norms are prevalent at any given time, which continues in different ways today, less severe than in the 20th century. But even if we ourselves, our hearts are idle factories and we're prone to greed and the lust for power, the libido dominado applies to us just as much as it does to the American soul. The fact remains that we have no radar, we have no navy, we have no air force, and we don't disappear people off the streets. So I'm wondering if Alan or Dave, as Christian theologians, would like to weigh in on this and maybe connect it to powers and principalities and whether or not it's a dead end to particularly maybe try to diagnose the specific political ideology that we're playing with. Is it flirting with authoritarianism? Has it merged into totalitarianism? Is it a new thing entirely? But how do we make sense of it in terms of the New Testament? Where do we go to in the scriptures to put words on this flux that Michael and David have described?
Dave, do you have anything?
I mean, we see what is evil and call it good is something that is happening significantly. And I think we're in one of those moments of, I tend to see a lot of continuity in things being over the last 25 years, and many things about the current administration, in particular in the previous 4 years, I tended to be on the side of minimizing the differences between that and what had gone before. It
Yeah.
was, yeah, I thought largely showing what was present. There were some new things in it, some some different forms of evil that would catch you off guard, but largely in continuity, in particular in use of military and police force. It was largely continuous. And so for me, especially coming of age and political age in the era of 9/11 that happened while I was in college, and I largely see where we are in continuity with that moment. This feels like we're still in the era of 9/11. But this moment in particular, while it still feels like that, does feel like we are also at a tipping point, a changing point, and looking at the case of particular individuals right now, who have been disappeared and acknowledged as wrongfully done so. And then just trying to imagine the US 20 years ago, while we were in the harshest throes of the response, post 9/11 response, having a citizen who was in a foreign prison who should not be there, and having it be like, well, what can we do? Like that, I literally cannot imagine that being a public response to that. And so this, how we're treating particular individuals right now is, I think, very, very revealing of a whole, and seeing the treatment of particular individuals changing in significant ways is very worrying. And it seems that we're, while still in a lot of continuity with how we responded to the events of 9/11, that there's a new explosion happening, and suddenly it's ricocheting in different directions and getting bigger. And that's it. It's the ricocheting effect is what I'm in the middle of experiencing and feeling. And having preached frequently, Elon Musk has been my go-to example of the rich man for every time I preach on stories talking about rich for a decade. Like, he's just been handy as a go-to. Trump was way back in the day, like when I was first studying theology, and he hadn't been that for a while. But Musk was perfect because everybody knew, oh, nobody likes him. Like, it's just such an easy. And now suddenly it's like, oh, you say a word about him, and that's taken as this. There's something that's shifting. We're less able to recognize clear and obvious wrong, and we're calling it good, and that is hitting much closer to home than it has in the past. And that's from having dear friends, when I protested our response to 9/11, saying, oh, well, you should leave the country and go to Canada, which I could have met Michael a few years earlier if that would have gone that way.
We'd have you, Dave.
Like,
We'd have
not
you.
naive about where we were before, but at this moment, there's it's getting deeper.
Back to the nationalism point, there's a phrase that has stuck with me for several years that I heard uttered by an important theologian by the name of Kevin Hargaden, saying that Christian baptism is the most political act ever in human history. And it seems to me that gets to the core of the problem of nationalism. If nationalism is just a reflection of a country's values, okay, fine, that might be all right. But if it gets to the point where it obscures universal justice, if it means that justice is only relevant or only applied within a particular national entity, and that justice does not extend, our concept of justice does not extend beyond the boundaries of that, then it seems to me it's become idolatrous if a Christian embraces that that mindset, because then you're saying that your neighbor is only someone who is within the national confines that you find yourself, rather than um, someone on the other side of the world who has been given citizenship in the kingdom of God in exactly the same way I have, that is through baptism. In other words, if the nation state eclipses the kingdom as um, the primary instantiation of identity, then you've entered the realm of idolatry. But it gets even worse if that kind of nationalism becomes a pretext for actively denying justice to people outside the national boundaries. Then it seems to me that it's entered the realm of the demonic. And that, I think, may be what I think we're seeing in the US now. And it's frightening.
And just to be clear for people, when you say demonic, you're not talking about some kind of Hollywood exorcist horror movie.
No, no, no,
Yeah.
no. But
Yeah,
I
yeah, you're not trying to give license to some kind of violence that others, current leaders of the American government or anything like that. You're using that in a
no,
quite strict theological definition.
I would say that what has happened is that the powers and principalities of the supernatural realm have in some way started to manifest themselves in the material, physical, political arena of a particular political arrangement.
I mean, Mammon's a good example of that, right? Like when Jesus, I mean, and Kevin, this is your, and Alan, this is your domain of research, right? But when Jesus talks about Mammon, he's talking about both material and spiritual realities that are fused in such a way that one amplifies the other and the other amplifies the other, right? So it's, is Mammon, a principality, a power, a demonic for whatever you want to call it, but how does that materialize within our society and produce very broad and deep effects, many of them damaging, violent, and what have you? And I think that's probably what Alan is gesturing towards is there's the material sort of damage and effects of the power, and then there's the spiritual realities that are bound to them. And when that happens and they're feeding off of each other, like watch out. And I think one way to know sort of where you're at is what, like I think about somebody like Dave, who is a pastor, like what can you say and what can't you say in your church without being at risk of getting fired, right? At this point, like that's a way to see where you're at. Like, what is it that you're going to say in a sermon on a Sunday that's going to get you in really hot water, maybe even fired or get death threats? And what isn't? And one of the things that I see as somebody who teaches, pastors and is just there to support them to do their work is like everybody implicitly knows certain things that you can't say that might get you fired, and then people have to make the decision whether or not they want to avoid them or take them on. And, like one way to get in there is just be like, what can't you say on Remembrance Day from the pulpit in Canada? Right? Like Remembrance Day is the day that we remember everybody who went to war in our past and our present. And, the States has a version of that. And how do churches talk about it on that day? And if you can't just say, well, maybe we can acknowledge the brutality of war and, yes, the very real struggles, and perhaps we can even use the word sacrifice of soldiers. But can we not overlay that with onto the cross of Christ, which is the sacrifice to end all war? Can we, like, if you can't say that from your pulpit without getting fired or getting death threats, like you might have a nationalism problem. And just how much of a problem you get if you say that tells you how close you are or how far you are away from the F word, fascism. But I think one of the things I would say very practically, I mean, fascism is about like binding and mobilizing people. And just as I hear us talking, and the question is like, are the people who certainly have authoritarian impulses and fascist impulses, it's not like they've tried to hide it, but do they have the ability to gather an amount of people that really creates that type of momentum to make this a real threat? I mean, I think that remains to be seen, but I definitely am, from where I'm looking, feel free to disagree with me, anybody, but I definitely see authoritarian and fascism impulses present here. But like, do they have it in them to gather and mobilize people beyond what they already have? I don't know, but we should be watching to make sure that they don't.
The Old Testament wisdom on the restraint of the sword, where David and the earliest kings of Israel are told not to keep a standing army, because
Hmm.
there's things that you can't do if you don't do those things first. And we do those things first, and we prioritize those things first above everything else. And so we are um, equipped to perform all kinds of evil that Canada is not, because of it takes a lot of years to develop the nuclear arsenal that we currently have to build up the apparatus, state apparatus, and so that it's where the heart is in the same place. There are things that we can do to stop it from being expressed to as great of an extent as we have the ability to do through the U.S. government.
Yeah, well, not that I'm competing here in terms of like militarization, because if we're getting in a competition with you folks, we're going to lose in Canada. But it does say a lot that the conservative government that is wants to oust the liberal government that we've had for the last while is running on strengthening our military. Like
Hmm.
that's one of the primary things that they are candidate on, and on other things too, combating woke ideology and common sense policies, getting rid of government bloat. But the military piece is a piece of their platform, and there's a lot of Christians who are telling us that we should vote conservative. So I mean, we're competing with the biggest military and arsenal like in the history of humanity. So we're never going to win that with you guys. But I'm just saying, like, it's happening over here too, where people are like, and Christians being like, "Yeah, we need a stronger military." I'm like, "Can you show me the place in the Bible where this is what it's telling us we need?" But I don't know. Maybe we're reading the different parts. I don't know. Call me crazy.
And if you recognize that Canada wouldn't win that fight, what do I tell to my neighbors who are like, "Oh, this is why I need to have guns to protect myself from the government"? What you gonna do?
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's yeah.
Well, Michael, you asked us to solve all the problems. I don't think we've managed to do that, but uh,
We've only really just surfaced a whole lot of problems, but I
this
think
is what theologians do, right?
yeah,
You
I
ask us a
think so.
question, and we ask you for more questions.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I think Kevin, maybe you can end with a thought. Just help us out here. From your perspective, give us one constructive takeaway. I just want one because I know you have it in you. We know you have it in you, not to put you on the spot, but put you on the spot a little bit before we wind down here. I know it's late in Ireland right now, by the way. So just don't even
It's
think.
so
Just
late it's become early, Michael.
okay.
I would say that an opportunity is opening up for the churches in the United States of America, but also in the Western world to rediscover their difference. Whether that's through baptism or whether that's through Eucharist, whether that's through the clear and uncompromised preaching of the word, there are practices that we have maintained and sustained and cultivated for millennia that now have a potent political relevance around identifying and naming our neighbor, I'm standing in solidarity with them, recognizing that to the extent that they are marginalized, weak, oppressed, vulnerable, trod upon, they are pictures of Christ, icons of God Himself. Uh, the, the, the church is not compatible with Western liberal democracy. All of the conservatives recognize J.D. Vance, there's a kernel of truth. But also, the church is not compatible with Western capitalism. It's not compatible with Western nationalism. It's not compatible with Western militarism. And I, what can I say except in moments of, as David says, flux, we go back to what we have always only ever been called to, which is faithfulness, bearing witness to the crucified Christ who was put to death by an empire with a sure and solid conviction of their racial superiority. So like I've got no new words except if the shit is hitting the fan, let us hold fast to the very old words that have tested and that have been tested and have been found to be true. So yeah, I would say the only opposition to powers and principalities is fasting, prayer, and radical generosity.
Amen.
Amen.
Yeah, and I have to go to America in July for work, and if the border agents see all this, I'm just joking. And I'm looking forward to America being made great again.
I mean, I honestly hope this doesn't get you in trouble, but if you're gonna create trouble, at least create the good kind. And I appreciate
I
you
hope so
all
too,
going on.
because a bunch of Catholic moral theologians are gathering together, and they're allowing me to come. So I won't tell the border agents what we're discussing, but
Don't worry,
yeah,
like not a lot of people listen to yet.
the algorithm does, John Michael. Yeah.
Yeah, it's true. Well, thank you for all of your time. I'm glad that we did this, and hopefully it's helpful to people who are tuning in. So, yeah. Thanks, folks.
Thanks, guys.